Okay, so in this lecture, I want to talk about big themes that show up across the entirety of season 4. And then in later lectures, I will narrow in on particular episodes that I think need more discussion. But right now, I want to talk about the season as a whole. I think that there are two big themes in this season that pull the whole season together. And they also play off one another and connect to one another. So I'll talk about them sequentially, and then I'll draw them together at the end. So first, one of the overriding themes of the season, which I think is super interesting philosophically, both from an ethical point of view and from a kind of a metaphysical point of view, is the theme of the concept of family, right? What counts as a family? How do we make families? What are good and bad ways of making families? Is what pulls something together as a family that they share DNA, that they share some sort of legal status, or something else? Right? This is actually, I think, a super important question philosophically and practically, because we live in a world where families are getting made in more and more different and more complicated ways, and it's a fuzzy concept for us, right? There's an old-fashioned idea that what a family is people who are related to one another by DNA and or by marriage, and probably the form that takes is a heterosexual couple and their children, and then their extended family of parents and siblings and so on. We have kind of a very stereotyped notion of what a family is, but that doesn't tell us what makes that a family. It doesn't get at the concept of family. So when we look at other kinds of family formations, we don't necessarily have a ready-made concept of family and family relations that we can draw on. What we see in this season is a host of very non-traditional forms of family and family relations. We see families being made in really unusual ways. So most obviously, Hollyhock has a very complicated family, right? Her primary family is an all-male family that has adopted her. She has 8 gay dads who are polyamorous and live with one another and make up a family unit and have adopted her. And so they're not related to one another genetically or to her genetically, and they don't follow the traditional heterosexual or monogamous model of family making at all. And we are repeatedly told that they make a great family and that they are completely loving and loved and that they take great care of Hollyhock and that they are her real dads. That point gets repeated throughout the season, right? That these are really her real dads. So the show definitely accepts the idea that this is one way of making a family. At the same time, she has some kind of family relationship to Bojack and to Bojack's mother, Beatrice, but it's not clear what it is. And she is genetically related to Bojack, but she doesn't know how that does or doesn't really make him her family member. In fact, there's ambiguity as to whether he's her father or her brother. She assumes throughout the season, and he does too, that he's her father. And later it turns out that genetically he's her brother, not her father. So that's a genetic family relation, but an ambiguous one. And one of the things that she struggles with, and Bojack struggles with throughout the entire season is, okay, they have this genetic bond, but in what sense, if any, do they have a family bond? What would that look like? She also doesn't know who her birth mother is, and she really wants to. So that's another kind of family relation, right? The relationship of mother and child they've given birth to that is very unstable for her. So the whole Hollyhock subplot very vividly asks, what kind of a difference does having a genetic relationship to somebody make? Or what kind of difference does being born from somebody's body make, right? Thinking just about the genetic point, right? Is having a genetic relationship to somebody enough to make you a family? Is it needed? Do you have to be genetically related to somebody in order to be a family member of theirs? Clearly not in this context. And then in terms of her mother, right, Hollyhock is openly unsure why she's so desperate to find her mother. She doesn't know why it's so important to her, but it is important to her. And that raises a philosophical and ethical question about why knowing our genetic relations is important. Why is that important to us? It's not important to everybody, but for people to whom it's important, why is it important to them when they have other adopted or non-genetic families that are satisfying and loving and caring, right? What do we try to get out of that genetic bond that we can't get out of an adopted family. Or possibly the answer is nothing. Right? Possibly the answer is the genetic bond adds nothing, but we're culturally trained up to think that it's super important. Hollyhock also doesn't know exactly what her relationship to Bojack should be. She doesn't know whether or how to think of him as a family member. Right? She says at one point when she's talking about her mother that she has a hole in her life because she doesn't know who her mother is, but that she doesn't know why she has that hole or what that hole is. She feels really guilty for wanting to know who her mother is. Right? At one point she says, "I don't need a mom." And Bojack says to her, "It's okay to want a mom." And she says, "No, it's not, because that means my dads weren't enough for me, and they are." That, too, I think raises a really interesting question. Can you need a specific kind of relationship without that implying that your other relationships are somehow deficient? Can we say, one at the same time, that her 8 dads are totally sufficient dads for her, and that they do a great job of being her parents, and also that there's something that she legitimately needs out of having a mother figure? The show doesn't really answer that question for us, but it's an important one, given that many of us have increasingly complicated family relationships. Right? On the question of what kind of family relationship she and Bojack have, right, they have this genetic bond, but it's not clear what it means. Later on, and I'll get back to this point, Bojack interprets their bond in terms of, he thinks that Hollyhock has inherited his depression, that she's inherited the voice inside her that tells her that she's worthless. And this is, of course, not a traditional genetic bond of any kind, but it is a sort of a powerful family bond if he's right about this. Okay, so there's the whole complicated Hollyhock family with the 8 gay dads and the polyamory and the uncertain biological connections to various other people. Another strong alternative family structure that we get on the table in this season is the weird family that gets made up about halfway through the season of Hollyhock plus Bojack's mother, plus arguably Bojack's mother's weird baby doll, who she treats as another child. They form a bizarre family unit, but none of their relations are normal family relations, especially since the mother, given that she has dementia, doesn't in fact even know what her relation is to either Bojack or to Hollyhock. And furthermore, Bojack and Hollyhock are at this point wrong about their relationship to each other and to her, right? Bojack and Hollyhock both think that they are father and daughter and that Beatrice is Hollyhock's grandmother, whereas in fact, Bojack and Hollyhock are brother and sister, and Beatrice is not related genetically to Hollyhock at all. So they're all completely confused about their relationships. Furthermore, none of those relationships are healthy and sustaining, right? None of them have the traditional things that we want out of family bonds, which, what that is one of the questions of the season, but something like understanding, mutual support, whatever it is that you would think that you would get out of having a family, this family doesn't seem to provide it. So I think in a way, the weird family that Hollyhock finds herself in Bojack's house is kind of the opposite, interestingly, of her gay poly family, right? So in her gay poly family, there's no genetic relationships, there's no traditional relationships, but she is kept very safe and supported, and they very much function as a family, whatever that means. In Bojack's house, there are all kinds of genetic relations going on. They really are related to one another in a DNA sense and in legal senses, and yet she's not kept safe. Quite the opposite, right? Being in that environment turns out to be almost fatally risky for her. Nobody actually is attending to her and keeping her safe the way family members should. Bojack and his mother kind of hate one another and don't understand one another and don't want to be in the same place as one another and are thrown together. So there isn't the kind of chosen bonds that she has at home with her poly dads. So this is a sort of a maximally dysfunctional family and an unsafe family, even though it is based on genetics, in contrast to the maximally functional and safe family that she has at home that isn't based on genetics. Notice, by the way, that Beatrice calls Bojack Henrietta throughout almost this entire season, and she also seems to interpret Hollyhock as Bojack's daughter. So in a way, she turns out to be more right than Bojack and Hollyhock are, right? Because Hollyhock is in fact Henrietta's daughter and not Bojack's. So she is, in an odd way, Beatrice is interpreting who Hollyhock is correctly. She's interpreting Hollyhock as not her granddaughter, but indirectly her granddaughter. So there's something odd there about it. It's not even clear who understands the relations best. Okay, other alternate families that show up and other alternate means of family building that show up in this season. Well, here's something that we've known all along, all the way through the show, but it becomes more relevant now. Notice that Horsing Around, the sitcom, is itself the story of non-traditional family making, right? Including cross-species family making. It's the story of Bojack's character, who is a horse, adopting 3 human children. And so our paradigm that Bojack keeps coming back to throughout the whole of the series of a sort of absolutely functional, loving, easy, typical family is actually this oddly non-genetic, non-traditional family. So one of the things I think we get out of this season and out of the show as a whole is what I'd like to call the denaturalization of the family. In other words, we tend to unreflectively think of families as natural entities based somehow on shared DNA or reproduction, whereas what we see in BoJack Horseman is that the most family-like families tend to be the unnatural families, the families that are formed in other ways, not through traditional natural bonds. We also have Princess Carolyn, who is trying to make a family, and she's trying to do it the so-called natural way by getting pregnant, but she can't do it, right? She keeps having miscarriages. And her relationship to family is super interesting, I think, because, for example, I'll talk about this more later, but her primary family ties that we see in this season are with her non-existent imaginary family. Right? In the episode Ruthie, we see her great-great-granddaughter. I think it's great-great. It might be great-great-great. But in any case, we see her descendant, Ruthie, and we learn that she sustains herself and gives herself hope through her imaginative connection to this descendant of hers. But the descendant is not real. So she's got a family that is important to her that's based entirely on fantasy. And in fact, when she has the miscarriage and loses her baby, which she had named Filbert, she turns Filbert into a TV show. And in some ways, the TV show, which is also called Filbert, arguably becomes her child. So she has this very non-standard family where what she's the mother to is a TV show. We also have, and this one I'll talk about a lot, right? We have the episode at the old Sugarman place, which is one of the most important episodes in the whole series, where Bojack goes back to his family's summer home specifically to work out how his identity is tied up with and continuous with the identities of his family members in the past, right? He's trying to find identity by tying himself into a family story that goes back 2 generations. And throughout this season, he desperately wants his mother to recognize him as who he is, as her son. And she doesn't, except for at the very end, right? She constantly thinks that he's Henrietta instead. Another interesting question is why this bothers him so much, right? What does it say about how family relationships are supposed to work that he needs not just the genetic tie to her, but he needs her recognition of their family connection, especially given that he hates her. Why is this important to him? What does he need out of that? Why does that make the family connection somehow real for him? Okay, so that was a whole bunch of different questions that I threw at you, but basically what I'm saying is that the show asks us in season 4, how do we make families let's decouple that from any idea of families as being just natural given structures and think about how they're socially created. And then within that, let's think about A, what does it take to actually have a family relationship or bond with somebody? B, why and how are those important to us? And C, why do we sometimes care about being connected to biological family members in specific ways if biology is not family destiny? If we can all agree that families can be made in various ways that aren't based on biology, then how does biology matter to us? Does it matter to us because it gives us something different, which is really important? Or does it matter to us perhaps just because we're told socially that biological relations are the ones that we should care about and that will make us feel whole? Okay, I'm going to pause there and go on to part 2.